The restaurant was full that night, white tablecloths low lighting the kind of place where no one raised their voice. But Graham Whitmore raised his. He stood over his wife's wheelchair wine glass in hand and laughed at her trembling fingers after she knocked over her drink. He called her useless. He called her a burden. He said it clearly in front of every table, and not one person moved to stop him. A young waiter stepped forward, quietly gripped the handles of her chair, and wheeled her toward the exit. Then just before the door, the woman's hand closed around the armrest, and she stood up. Elias Carter had worked at Hargroves for almost 2 years, and in that time, he had learned one thing about the kind of people who ate there. They did not like being watched when they were at their worst. So they tipped well and smiled at the staff, and the staff smiled back, and everyone pretended the whole arrangement was perfectly natural. He moved through the dining room the way he always did, quietly, efficiently, with the kind of controlled stillness that came not from comfort, but from practice. Elias was 34 years old and had been doing jobs like this since he was 19, carrying other people's food and other people's bags and other people's problems so long that he had almost stopped noticing the weight. He had debts. That was the simplest way to put it. His wife Donna had been sick for 2 years before she died, and the cost of that illness, the hospital stays. The specialists, the medications that insurance covered only partially, had left him with a number he worked towards slowly every month through the restaurant shifts and the early morning delivery runs and the occasional weekend security work. He did not talk about it. There was nothing to say that the numbers didn't already say for him. He lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Logan Square, ate simply, slept when he could, and kept moving. The grief had not gone away. He had just learned to work around it the way you learn to walk on a foot that healed wrong. That Tuesday evening, the private dining room at Hargroves had been reserved for a corporate anniversary celebration, the kind of event where the wine cost more than Elias made in a week, and the laughter was always slightly too loud to be genuine. He'd worked enough of these to know the rhythm guests arrived in clusters. The conversation ran on status updates and carefully worded compliments, and sometime around the second course, someone always said something they would regret. Usually the room absorbed it. Usually no one outside the table ever knew. He was refilling water glasses near the east wall when he first noticed the woman in the wheelchair. She was seated slightly apart from the main table near the edge of the seating arrangement, as though she had been placed there as an afterthought. She was composed on the surface, straight-backed, dressed well, hair pinned neatly, but there was something in the way she held her hands in her lap, fingers laced tight, that read, less like poise and more like endurance. Elias recognized that look. He had worn it himself most days. Her husband was easy to identify. Graham Whitmore was the kind of man who occupied a room by assumption, broad-shouldered silver at the temples, wearing a suit that probably cost $4,000 without blinking. He spoke in the declarative. He laughed at his own observations before finishing them. He was the host of the event in every practical sense, even though the reservation was technically under the company name, and the other guests moved around him with the careful deference of people who needed something from him. Elias had served men like Graham before. He did not dislike them on principle. He simply knew what they looked like when no one was watching. The incident happened midway through the third course. Graham was mid-sentence, addressing 2 men across the table, when his wife's hand trembled against her glass. It was a small thing, the kind of tremor that comes from pain held too long without acknowledgement, and the glass tilted and the wine spilled across the white linen. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was quiet and accidental and entirely human. Elias was already moving toward the table with a cloth when Graham turned. Graham did not lower his voice. "For God's sake, Celeste." He set down his own glass with a precise, contemptuous click. "Can you not manage a single glass of wine without making a scene?" The table went still. Not dramatically, just the specific, loaded stillness of people deciding all at once not to look. A few guests examined their plates. One woman near the window found something suddenly interesting about her phone. The two men Graham had been talking to both developed the same distant diplomatic expression, as though whatever was happening was occurring somewhere slightly to the left of their field of vision. Graham was not finished. He pushed back from his chair and straightened his jacket with the unhurried ease of someone who understood that no one in the room was going to challenge him. His voice was controlled, almost pleasant, which made it worse. Every event, every single time. He gestured toward his wife with the casual dismissal of a man describing an inconvenience, a broken appliance, a missed delivery. You know what it's like bringing her anywhere. It's like being responsible for a very expensive liability. Half the people here feel sorry for me. The other half just feel sorry for her. Celeste did not respond. She sat with her hand still in her lap, her gaze fixed at a point somewhere past the center of the table, her jaw set in a way that had clearly taken years of practice. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She had heard this before, that much was obvious. She had heard it enough times to have learned how to absorb it in public without visibly breaking. That Elias thought was not strength. That was something else entirely. That was someone who had stopped expecting anything different. No one at the table spoke. No one at the surrounding tables spoke. The dining room had developed a collective, careful deafness, the kind that expensive places were very good at manufacturing on short notice. Elias set down the cloth he was holding. He crossed the room and stopped beside Celeste's wheelchair, and he kept his voice low, and even directed entirely at her. "Ma'am, there's a small terrace just off the lobby. It's quiet. Would you like some air? I can take you there." Graham's eyes moved to him immediately sharp, and assessing the look of a man who did not like unexpected variables. But Elias had already angled the wheelchair slightly away from the table, and he asked again quietly just for Celeste. She looked up at him. And whatever she saw, some combination of the offer being genuine, the tone being level the fact that he was asking rather than directing, she gave a small nod. He wheeled her out of the dining room through the corridor and toward the side exit. The glass door opened onto a narrow terrace that overlooked the street below, lit by a single overhead lamp. It was cold out, but not brutally so, and the sudden absence of the room, its warmth, its noise, its careful indifference, made the air feel like something earned. Elias positioned her chair facing the railing and straightened up, giving her space. He did not try to fill the silence with reassurance. He had learned after enough long nights that reassurance offered too quickly was mostly for the person giving it. It was Celeste who spoke first. Her voice was steadier than he expected. Low and precise, with the slight flatness of someone who had cried recently enough that the remaining emotion had simply run dry. "You didn't have to do that." "No," he said. "You could get in trouble. With management. With him." "I know." She looked at the street below them for a moment. Then, without warning or any visible exertion, she reached forward and closed both hands around the armrests of the wheelchair. Her knuckles whitened. Her arms shook. And slowly, she pushed herself upright. She stood fully for approximately 5 seconds, long enough to be real, long enough to mean something. And then her legs gave out beneath her, and she dropped back into the chair, breathing hard, gripping the armrests. Elias moved forward, reflexively steadying the chair. He said nothing. He waited. "I didn't fall," she said, mostly to herself. Then more evenly. "I almost didn't fall." He stayed where he was, close enough to be useful, far enough to give her room to have the moment without an audience. After a while, she turned to look at him again, studying him with the specific attention of someone deciding whether or not to say something they had not planned on saying. "My doctors told me 8 months ago that I could recover," she said. "Partial mobility first. Possibly full if I continued the physical therapy." She said it flatly, like reading a fact off a page. "Graham pulled the funding for the sessions 2 months after that." Elias listened. He said the recovery was uncertain, that it was financially impractical to invest in treatment with no guaranteed outcome. Her voice stayed even, but something behind it had sharpened. That's the logic he used. Financially impractical. But you believe the doctors, Elias said. I know the doctors are right, she said. I can feel it. That's the thing, I can feel that my legs are coming back. Slowly. Barely. But they are. And he knows that too. She pressed her lips together. Which is exactly why he stopped the sessions. Elias turned that over for a moment. He had heard a lot of things across a lot of service jobs, fragments of private conversations that people had, too loudly in front of waitstaff, because they had stopped registering staff as people. He had heard selfishness, cruelty, carelessness. But this was specific in a way that settled differently. This was deliberate, calculated. The kind of thing a man did not do out of anger, but out of planning. He controls everything while I'm in that chair, Celeste said. The accounts, the board decisions, the access to the company assets that were supposed to be shared. She gestured at herself at the chair at the whole arrangement. This is useful to him. And if you walked again, then I'm useful to myself instead. She said it without bitterness, just as a fact. And there are things in those financials that I'd start looking at very closely. Elias leaned against the railing and looked at the street. A cab moved past below. A couple walked quickly against the cold shoulders up. He thought about the life waiting for him tomorrow morning, the early delivery shift, the afternoon double at the restaurant, the numbers in the notepad on his kitchen counter that still didn't add up to anything comfortable. He thought about what it meant to get involved in a situation that belonged to people with lawyers and influence and the kind of money that made problems disappear. He was not naive about what that disparity meant in practical terms. He also thought about what Celeste's face had looked like, sitting alone at that table, while her husband described her as a liability to a room full of people who chose not to hear it. The therapy, he said finally. Is it the kind of thing that requires a clinic? Or can it be done somewhere else? Celeste looked at him. There was something careful and watchful in her expression. Not hope, exactly not yet, but the controlled predecessor to it. The kind of look that had learned not to form too fast. There are exercises, specific ones. A therapist showed me the protocol before the sessions were cut. I still have the materials. She stopped. Why? Because I have mornings free on Tuesdays and Thursdays, Elias said. And whatever the protocol requires, I can learn it. It was a straightforward thing to say, practically speaking. And yet the weight of it landed clearly between them because they both understood what it actually meant, that he was choosing to stand on the wrong side of Graham Whitmore, with no protection and no leverage entirely, because it was the right thing to do. There was no complicated reasoning behind it. Elias was not a man who had a great deal left to lose, and there was something almost liberating about that. The debts, the solitude, the hollow shape of a life rebuilt after grief, none of it was collateral that Graham could threaten him with, because he had already lived through the worst version of losing. What was left was just the question of what he did with the time remaining. Celeste did not say thank you immediately. She looked at him for a long moment, with that same careful measuring attention, as though checking the offer for the catch. When she found none, she turned back to face the street. He'll find out, she said. Eventually. He watches everything. Maybe, Elias said. He has people. He'll come after your job first. That's always the first move. Probably. She was quiet for a moment. Then quietly enough that it was almost private. I've been trying to find a reason to keep fighting this. For 8 months, I've been trying. She did not look at him when she said it. Tonight's the first time anyone treated me like the decision was mine to make. Elias didn't respond to that. There was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish it. He just moved around to the back of her chair and waited to see if she was ready to go back inside. After a moment, she straightened her jacket, settled her hands in her lap, and gave a small nod. He wheeled her toward the glass door. The warmth and noise of the restaurant came back gradually, the clink of glasses, the low murmur of careful conversation, the particular sound of a room full of people performing comfort for each other. She did not go back to Graham's table. She asked Elias to take her directly to the lobby, where she called her own car service, and left without saying good night to anyone. Graham found out she had left before the dinner was over. Elias knew this because he saw Graham stand up from the table, suddenly check his phone, and look toward the door with an expression that was not concern. It was the expression of a man whose plans had been interrupted. He made 2 phone calls in quick succession, standing near the window, speaking in a low, controlled voice that Elias could not hear, but did not need to. By the time Elias's shift ended and he walked out into the cold Chicago night, the street was quiet. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, hands in his jacket pockets, watching a bus move slowly through the intersection. He was tired, the way he was tired every night, not just physically, but at some deeper structural level, the kind of tired that sleep no longer fully fixed. He thought about what he had agreed to. He thought about how little sense it made on paper. And then he thought about those 5 seconds on the terrace, the locked arms, the shaking hands, the fraction of a second, where Celeste Whitmore stood completely on her own. And he decided that some things didn't need to make sense on paper. He walked to the bus stop and waited. The city moved around him indifferent and constant. Whatever was coming next, it would start Tuesday morning. The first session was on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the dinner at Hargrove's. Celeste had texted the address to Elias from a number he didn't recognize, a secondary phone. He assumed one that Graham didn't monitor. The Whitmore estate was in Lincoln Park, a brick and limestone house set back from the street behind a wrought iron fence, the kind of property that announced money without needing to try. Elias arrived at 7:15 before the housekeeper came in, and Celeste met him at the side entrance herself, already in the hallway, the folder of therapy materials in her lap. The exercises were specific and sequential, a protocol designed around nerve reactivation and controlled weight-bearing, built to be done consistently daily, if possible, twice weekly at minimum. Celeste walked him through each one, methodically reading from the printed sheets, with the focus of someone who had memorized them months ago and was only consulting the pages out of habit. She knew exactly what her body could and couldn't do. She had been paying attention even when no one else was. They worked in the long corridor off the kitchen, where there was a wall on one side and enough open space on the other for her to fall safely. Because she did fall. Multiple times in that first session, forward sideways, once directly back into the chair, with enough force to knock the breath out of her. She didn't ask for sympathy. She asked Elias to note which exercises had caused the most instability so she could weight them more heavily next time. By the end of the 3rd week, she could stand unsupported for nearly 40 seconds. By the end of the 5th, she was taking 3 steps before kneading the wall. They did not celebrate these increments because Celeste had decided very early on that celebrating partial progress was a way of making peace with incompletion, and she wasn't interested in that. She logged everything in a small notebook she kept in the drawer of her bedside table and said very little about what it meant to her. Elias understood. He had his own version of that particular discipline. Graham traveled frequently board meetings in New York, investor dinners in Dallas, the rotating schedule of a man whose importance to others required constant demonstration. Celeste had learned his patterns across years of marriage, and she mapped the sessions around his absences with the same precision she brought to everything else. For a while it worked. The house was quiet, the housekeeper was discreet, and the sessions accumulated without incident. Then Graham started coming home early. It happened twice in the same week, once on a Wednesday, once the following Friday, both times without advance notice. He did not say anything directly. He simply walked through the corridor where they worked and observed briefly before continuing to whatever room he was going to. But his expression both times carried a specific quality that Elias recognized the look of a man filing information away for later use. That same week, Celeste noticed a car parked across the street that had not been there before. It was there Tuesday morning and gone by noon. It was back Thursday, different plates, same make. Graham also began a quieter campaign at home. Not confrontational, not angry, but persistent in the way that water is persistent. He would mention offhandedly at dinner that Dr. Harmon, the specialist, who had originally outlined Celeste's recovery plan, had apparently revised his projections downward. That the therapy approach she had been pursuing was considered outdated in the current literature. That he had spoken to 3 other physicians who were skeptical. None of it was verifiable. None of it was meant to be. It was designed to be repeated often enough that the uncertainty became its own kind of weight. "He's trying to make you doubt the process," Elias said on a Thursday morning in late November, after Celeste repeated what Graham had said at dinner the night before. "I know that," she said. "Knowing it doesn't make it stop working. How much of it is working?" She stood at the wall, one hand resting against it lightly, less for support now than for orientation. She looked at her reflection in the hallway mirror for a moment, before answering. "Some days I wake up and I believe everything he says. That I'm deteriorating instead of improving. That the feeling in my legs is phantom sensation and not actual recovery." She pressed her palm flat against the wall. "And then I stand up and take 6 steps, and I know that he's lying. But you only get that certainty in the moment. The rest of the time, you're just trying to hold on to it." It was the most she had said about the emotional mechanics of what Graham was doing to her. Elias didn't push further. He just repositioned himself at the end of the corridor and told her to try the sequence again. The job loss came on a Monday, 12 days after that conversation, the second week of December. The manager at Hargroves called him in before the lunch shift and explained with visible discomfort that the restaurant had received a formal complaint about an employee engaging in inappropriate personal conduct, with a high-profile guest specifically inserting himself into a private family matter and escorting a guest off the premises without authorization. The complaint had come from Graham Whitmore's office, directly accompanied by a legal letter, and what the manager described only as significant pressure from people we can't afford to antagonize. Elias was given 2 weeks of severance and asked to return his uniform by Friday. He sat in his car in the parking structure for a while after that. He ran the numbers. Without Hargroves, he was short about $900 a month, manageable if he picked up extra delivery shifts, uncomfortable, but not catastrophic. He called the delivery dispatch service on the way home and added 3 additional morning routes. He did not contact Celeste about it until the following Tuesday session, and when he told her, he kept it factual without framing it as a grievance. She heard him out without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment before she said, "I'll cover the difference." "No," he said. "Elias, no," he said, again in the same tone. "That's not what this is." She looked at him steadily for a moment, and then she let it go. She understood what he meant, even if she didn't say so. There was a particular kind of dignity that came with having very little, and Elias was not willing to trade it for convenience. The discovery came 4 days later, on a Wednesday night. Graham had been home for 6 days straight, the longest stretch in months. Celeste had been using the late hours to review the household accounts, one of the few areas of financial access Graham had not yet fully revoked. She found the discrepancy in a transfer summary attached to a forwarded email that Graham had accidentally copied to a shared account. The transfer was substantial 7 figures, routed through 2 shell companies to an account registered in the name of a woman named Brooke Calloway, whom Celeste recognized from a board event 3 years prior. It was not a one-time transfer. There was a pattern going back 14 months. When she confronted Graham that night, he didn't deny it. He stood in the study doorway with his hands in his pockets and looked at her with something closer to irritation than guilt, like a man who had simply been inconvenienced by the timing. "You were going to transfer everything before filing," Celeste said. "Then walk away clean. The company's financial restructuring is a board-level decision," Graham said in the tone he used when he wanted to make her feel stupid for not understanding something he was deliberately obscuring. "You wouldn't follow the structure even if I explained it." "You had the recovery reports," she said. Her voice was level, but her hands on the armrests of her wheelchair were white-knuckled. Dr. Harmon sent updated assessments in March, in June, and again in September. All three of them showed measurable neurological improvement. "You told me in June that he had found no change." She looked at him directly. "You kept them from me. All three." Graham said nothing for a moment. Then he walked to the sideboard, poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon, and turned back with the glass in his hand, unhurried, deliberate, making the whole room wait for him. "You were more manageable this way," he said finally. "That's the reality. When you're in that chair, you're easier to plan around. When you're not, you become a problem. You've always been a problem when you have too much room to move." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. Celeste believed it completely because it explained everything, every canceled appointment, every offhand comment designed to chip at her confidence. Every morning she had woken up unsure whether the sensation in her legs was progress or imagination. It had all been architecture, deliberately constructed to keep her exactly where she was. She called Elias the following morning and told him what she had found, and she told him what she intended to do. Gather the documentation, contact the company's independent financial auditors, and prepare a formal disclosure for the board. She needed 2 things from him: a witness to the timeline and help with physical preparation for the public disclosure she had in mind. Elias listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said he was in. What followed was 3 weeks of escalation that ran on 2 tracks simultaneously. On one track, Celeste and Elias worked the therapy sessions harder than before, mornings, afternoons, when possible focused entirely on building duration and distance the number of steps before the legs gave way. On the other track, Graham responded to what he clearly sensed was a change in his wife's disposition by tightening every control he had access to. He froze the household accounts tied to Celeste's name. He dismissed the housekeeper, the only domestic staff member Celeste had trusted, with 2 days' notice. He canceled her standing car service account, eliminating her primary means of independent transport. He did all of it through the legitimate instruments available to him as the controlling partner in the marriage, and he did it efficiently, without anger, because anger would have required him to acknowledge that she was a threat. The pressure on Elias came differently. One evening after a delivery shift, 3 men were waiting near his car in the parking lot behind his apartment building. They did not identify themselves or explain the message. They didn't need to. He walked away with a split lip and 2 cracked ribs, and a very clear understanding that someone with resources had decided he was an expendable variable. He taped the ribs himself, iced the lip, and showed up at Celeste's side entrance the following Tuesday morning, 9 minutes early. Celeste saw his face and said nothing at first. Then, he crossed a line. "He crossed several," Elias said, "which is useful. Documented injuries are evidence." She looked at him for a long moment, and something moved in her expression that she didn't quite suppress, some combination of gratitude and guilt that she clearly didn't know what to do with. "You should stop," she said. "You should walk away. Reasonably practically, you should walk away." "Probably," Elias said. He sat down on the hallway bench and tested the range of motion in his ribs carefully, then stood back up. "Are we doing the sequences or not?" The fall happened on a Thursday in the 4th week of the escalated training mid-January. By then the corridor cold, despite the heating. Celeste was attempting a longer corridor walk 12 steps from the wall to the doorframe, when her left leg locked mid-stride, the knee buckling sideways rather than forward, dropping her weight to the wrong side. She went down hard, catching the edge of the doorframe with her shoulder on the way. Elias was across the corridor in seconds and had her stable, but the shoulder had taken the impact badly, and by the time the pain was fully present, she was white-faced and breathing through her teeth. The doctor Celeste called was her own private physician. Not one Graham had access to a woman named Dr. Patricia Voss, who had been discreetly monitoring Celeste's progress since early in the year. Dr. Voss examined the shoulder and ran a secondary assessment on the leg that had given way, and when she finished, she sat down and was direct in the way good physicians are when they have no interest in softening something that needs to be heard clearly. "The shoulder is manageable," she said. "The leg is a different concern. The particular muscle group that failed today has been under sustained stress, and the way it failed suggests we are close to the edge of what the nerves can handle right now. If you continue at this intensity and that muscle group fails again under load, the window for full recovery may close." She looked at Celeste steadily. "I'm not telling you to stop. I'm telling you that if you continue, the next fall cannot be a training fall. It needs to be the last one." After Dr. Voss left, Celeste sat in the corridor for a long time without speaking. Elias sat against the wall across from her, close enough to be present, far enough to give the silence room. Outside, through the high window at the end of the hall, the sky had gone the flat gray of a Chicago afternoon in mid-January, and the light was already thinning toward early evening. "There's an event on Saturday," Celeste said eventually. "Graham's deal announcement. The Alderton merger. It's the largest acquisition of his career. He's hosting it at the Meridian Grand." She turned the notebook she was holding over in her hands without opening it. "Every major investor, every board member, every press contact he has will be in that room. He's already told me I'm expected to attend." Her mouth moved briefly in something that wasn't quite a smile. "He wants me there, in the chair. It makes him look like a devoted husband managing a difficult situation. It's always worked before." "You're thinking about doing it there," Elias said. "I have everything," she said. "The transfers, the hidden reports, the account documentation. I've had it prepared for 10 days. She set the notebook down in her lap. "If I'm going to do this, that room is where it has to happen, in front of every person whose opinion actually costs him something." Elias thought about the doctor's words. He thought about the cracked ribs still taped under his shirt. He thought about what it meant that Celeste had survived everything done to her over the past several years, and was now sitting in a cold corridor, measuring the distance between where she was and where she needed to be, with exactly the same quiet precision she brought to every other impossible calculation in her life. "2 more sessions before Saturday," he said. "We work the left leg specifically. Short distances, controlled weight. Not 12 steps 4. Solid, stable, repeatable. We don't need distance. We need the left leg to hold long enough for you to get to that stage under your own power." She looked at him. 4 steps won't get me to the podium." 4 steps will prove the leg can carry you," he said. "Once it knows it can, so will you. The rest is momentum." She held his gaze for a moment. It was not a guarantee. They both knew that. It was simply the honest mechanics of what they had left to work with, and she had never wanted anything other than honesty from him. She opened the notebook to a fresh page, clicked her pen, and wrote the date at the top. Whatever was coming, she was going to be ready for it. The Meridian Grand occupied the top 2 floors of a building on Michigan Avenue, and on the night of the Alderton merger announcement, it was exactly the kind of room that Graham Whitmore had been building his entire career toward. 300 guests. Every investor who mattered, every board contact he had cultivated over 20 years, press people from 4 financial publications, and a staging setup that made the whole event feel less like a business announcement and more like a coronation. Graham had planned it down to the lighting. The centerpiece podium was positioned so that whoever stood at it would have the full room behind them, a visual designed to make the speaker look inevitable. Celeste arrived in the wheelchair as expected. Graham had arranged for her to be seated near the front of the room, visible enough to read, as the devoted wife, far enough from the stage that she would not interfere with the optics. She was dressed carefully, a dark, structured jacket, her hair down, and she had brought nothing with her that looked like documentation. The files were on a tablet inside her small clutch, encrypted and ready, connected to the event's presentation system through a contact she had arranged access with 3 days prior. She had been precise about every detail. She had also taken a low dose of a prescribed pain inhibitor 2 hours before arrival, at Dr. Voss's instruction to manage the nerve sensitivity in the left leg through the evening. Not enough to compromise function, enough to give her a controlled window. Elias was not in the room. They had agreed on that. He was in the lobby in a jacket and tie that did not belong to a uniform, waiting near the east corridor. His job was proximity, not presence. Close enough to matter if something went wrong, invisible enough not to give Graham an additional target before Celeste was ready. The program ran for 40 minutes before Graham took the stage. He spoke about the merger with the fluency of a man who had rehearsed without appearing to rehearse, landing each statistic at the exact moment it would land best, working the room with the ease of someone who had never seriously considered the possibility of a room not being his. The investors laughed when he wanted them to laugh. They leaned forward when he wanted them to lean. He was in this setting, entirely in his element, and he knew it, and the room knew it, and the whole thing had the settled, foregone quality of a performance whose outcome was never in question. Then he departed from the prepared remarks. It happened at the end of his closing segment smoothly, as though it had been planned all along. He gestured toward the front of the room, toward Celeste, and smiled the way men smile when they are about to be publicly generous. "Before we move to the reception, I want to take a moment for something personal," he said. "Many of you know that the last few years have been challenging for my family. My wife, Celeste, has faced a serious health situation that has required a great deal of management from her care team, and honestly, from me." He let that land. Several guests nodded with the specific sympathy of people performing sympathy for a room. Celeste has been a gracious partner through all of it, as she always has been. But I think we all understand at this stage that certain decisions, certain responsibilities, require a level of capacity and stability that her current situation doesn't allow. He said it gently, the way a surgeon delivers news before the anesthesia takes full effect. "I'll be formally assuming sole executive authority over the Whitmore Group's joint holdings, effective with the close of this merger. It's simply the practical thing, the right thing," he had not told her. Not that he was going to say it here in this room, in front of these people framed as a reasonable accommodation for a wife who could no longer manage. He had arranged the legal paperwork, quietly filed through his attorney, structured so that her signature was not required, because her capacity had been documented by a physician he had retained, whose report she had never seen as functionally compromised. It was the last piece. After tonight, the financial restructuring would be complete. The transfer to Brooke Calloway's holding account would finalize within 30 days, and Celeste would have no legal standing to contest any of it, because the record would show she had lacked the capacity to manage her own affairs for over a year. Graham was already stepping back from the podium, gesturing for 2 event staff members to wheel Celeste forward toward the center of the room, toward the stage, clearly intending it as a tableau. The devoted husband, the incapacitated wife, the magnanimous assumption of burden. A performance of care that was actually its final instrument of control. The staff members moved her chair forward. The room watched. And then Celeste reached down and set the brake on the wheelchair herself. The 2 staff members stopped. Graham from the side of the stage registered the movement and went very still. Celeste opened the clutch in her lap, removed the tablet, and held it in one hand. She looked at the room, not at Graham, not at the stage, but at the room itself, steadily, the way a person looks at something they are finished being afraid of. Then she closed both hands on the armrests and pushed herself upright. Her legs held. The left one trembled. She could feel the deep, specific vibration of muscle fiber working at the edge of its current capacity, but it held. She had done 4 steps in training. She had done them clean, both sessions, no variance, exactly as Elias had called it. What she hadn't told him, and what she understood now with complete clarity, was that the training steps and these steps were entirely different animals. In the corridor, every step had been a calculation. Here, with 300 people silent and Graham frozen at the side of the stage, the calculation collapsed into something simpler. She just moved, 1 step forward, then another, then a third, and the left leg held, and a fourth, and it still held, and she did not stop. By the time she reached the steps at the side of the stage, she had taken 11 steps without stopping, and the room had not made a sound. She climbed the 2 steps to the stage with one hand on the railing. She walked to the podium. She placed the tablet on the lectern and looked out at the room, and when she spoke, her voice was completely steady. "I apologize for the departure from the program," she said. "What I have to share won't take long." What she presented in the following 14 minutes was specific, documented, and irrefutable. The 7-figure transfers to Brooke Calloway's holding company, time-stamped and traced. The 3 medical assessments from Dr. Harmon, the ones from March, June, and September, that Graham had intercepted and replaced with summary language indicating no significant change. The capacity assessment filed by Graham's retained physician, submitted without Celeste's knowledge, and directly contradicting the independent findings of Dr. Patricia Voss. And the legal filing dated 2 weeks prior, initiating the transfer of sole executive authority drafted without her consent, and made possible only by the fraudulent capacity documentation. She walked through each document once clearly without editorializing. The room did not need her interpretation. The document said everything they needed to say. Graham did not move from the side of the stage for the first few minutes. Then, when it became clear that the room was watching the documents and not him, he walked toward the exit at the back. He made it halfway before 2 of the company's independent board members stepped in front of him, not physically stopping him, but standing in a way that made departure feel inadvisable. He stopped. He turned and looked at the stage one final time, and his expression was not rage. It was the expression of a man who had simply run out of room to operate. By morning, 3 board members had called for an emergency audit. Graham's attorney issued a statement by noon that used the phrase, "full cooperation with any review process." The financial press ran the story by early afternoon. The Alderton merger was formally paused pending the outcome of the inquiry. Celeste left the Meridian Grand that night on her own feet. She made it to the lobby before her legs required the chair again, and she sat down in it without embarrassment, because the point had never been permanence. The point had been the room. The point had been 11 steps in front of every person whose opinion had ever been used as a tool against her. Elias was waiting near the east corridor. He saw her come through from the main hall, walking, then sitting, then being wheeled by an event staff member toward the lobby, and he did not say anything for a moment. He just looked at her with the specific expression of someone who already knew what had happened and was still processing the weight of it being real. 11 steps, she said. "I counted," he said. She smiled at that, briefly, tiredly, the smile of someone who had been holding an enormous amount of tension for a very long time, and had just been given permission to set it down. The months that followed were not simple. That was the honest version of it. Graham's investigation moved through the legal system with the slow, grinding momentum of institutional processes that could not be rushed by either side. The forensic accountants worked through the company's financial structure layer by layer, and with each layer came new documentation that required Celeste's attention, her testimony, her signature. She was present for all of it. She also continued the therapy sessions with Dr. Voss, now formally supervising, and the progress she had made in the corridor of her house continued to compound in the structured clinical setting. The sessions were harder in some ways, more precise, more demanding and easier in others, because she was no longer doing them around the edges of a life that was actively trying to stop her. There were mornings when the legal process felt endless, and the recovery felt slow, and the sheer volume of what Graham had taken from her, not just financially, not just physically, but years of her own confidence in her own perception, felt like something she would never fully account for. She told Elias this one morning in February, sitting in the therapy room at Dr. Voss's clinic, while the snow came down outside, in the particular flat, relentless way Chicago delivers February. She said it plainly without performing the difficulty or understating it. Elias listened. Then he said, "You know what it's like to be behind on something for years, and not know if you'll ever catch up, and you just keep going anyway, because stopping doesn't actually solve the problem." He looked at his hands for a moment. "That's just what this is. You keep going. The math takes care of itself eventually." She looked at him for a long moment. They were both quiet people, both accustomed to carrying large things without an audience, and they had been in each other's company enough by now that the silence between them had a texture not empty, not uncomfortable, but populated with the particular understanding of two people who had each seen the other at a low point and stayed anyway. "Donna," she said. She had known about his wife for months. By then he had mentioned her once, briefly, factually, in the way he mentioned most things about himself. "Did you ever stop feeling behind what?" He thought about it honestly, the way he did everything. "Some days," he said. "It comes and goes. But it's different now. It used to feel like a deficit. Now it just feels like part of the shape of things." He looked at the window. "Doesn't hurt the same way." That conversation was the closest either of them came for a long time to acknowledging what had been building between them, something neither of them had been looking for, and both of them had arrived at sideways through shared difficulty and mutual respect, and the specific intimacy of showing up for someone over and over in the unglamorous middle of things. They did not rush it. They were both by temperament and by experience. People who understood the value of not rushing things that were already moving in the right direction. By spring, Celeste had regained full functional mobility, not performative functional. She walked to the clinic. She walked through grocery stores. She walked the long corridor of what had been the marital home, now entirely hers, pending the divorce settlement without thinking about it. The wheelchair stayed in the front hall for a while, and then one morning she moved it to a storage room without ceremony, because it had served its purpose, and she no longer needed it as a symbol or a weapon or a reminder of anything. The company's board formally reinstated her executive authority in April, following the completion of the financial audit. Graham was removed from his position and faced a civil action from 3 sets of defrauded investors. His attorney was already negotiating terms. Brooke Calloway's holding company was dissolved. The transfers were reversed where they could be reversed, and litigated where they couldn't. Celeste did not gloat about any of this. She just went to work. She established the Whitmore Foundation in June, a charitable organization focused on support services for disabled individuals who had experienced financial control or emotional abuse from partners or family members. It was specific because she had been specific about what she needed when she needed it, and found nothing available. The foundation provided legal advocacy, independent medical assessments, and access to physical therapy for people who could not afford it or had been systematically cut off from it. The first operational grant cycle launched in September. She called Elias in late May before the foundation was publicly announced, and asked him to come to her office, the real one, in the Whitmore Group building on Wacker Drive, with her name on the door and the city spread out behind her through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She offered him the position of operations director for the foundation, not as charity. She said this clearly without softening it. The position required someone with integrity, practical competence, and the specific kind of judgment that did not collapse under pressure. She had watched him demonstrate all three under circumstances specifically designed to make them difficult. She needed someone she trusted. She trusted him. Elias accepted. He said it simply without the particular performance of gratitude that she would not have wanted from him anyway. He gave notice on his delivery routes that week. He paid the last remaining balance on the hospital debt the following Friday, the number he had been carrying for 3 years, the one that had defined the shape of his daily life since Dana died. And he sat with that fact for a while quietly in his apartment in Logan Square, before making dinner and going to bed. There was no dramatic feeling attached to it, just the clean, specific relief of a weight that had been present so long he had almost stopped registering it as weight. 1 year after the night at Hargrove's on a Tuesday evening in late autumn, Celeste walked through the front door of the restaurant. The maitre d' recognized her and showed no visible reaction, because Hargrove's was trained for exactly that. She was in heels, modest ones, but heels and a coat she had bought in September, and she walked through the lobby without looking at the corridor where she had once sat with trembling hands, while her husband described her to a room as a liability. Elias was at the entrance, standing just inside the door in a dark suit. Not an event staff uniform, his own. He had arrived first, partly by arrangement, and partly because he was constitutionally incapable of being late to things that mattered. He watched her come through the door and did the brief instinctive assessment that had become habit over the past year, checking her gait, her posture, the distribution of her weight, and found nothing to note except that she moved the way she had always moved when no one was trying to stop her. Evenly, without hesitation, she reached him and took his hand. Not urgently, not dramatically, just with the settled ease of something that had been true for a while. They walked together toward the dining room, through the warmth and the low light, and the careful noise of a place that had once witnessed the worst night of her life, and now had no idea what to do with her return. The table was already set. The room was full. Nobody looked twice. That was, she thought, exactly right. She had not come back to reclaim anything. She had come back because it was just a restaurant, and she was just a person, and that was the whole point. The chair was not there. The pity was not there. The man who had used both against her was not there. There was only the room and the seat, and Elias's hand in hers, and the straightforward fact of continuing. That was enough. That was, it turned out, everything. The most powerful thing a person can do for someone who has been told they are broken is simply to help them stand. Not because you need them to, but because they deserve the chance to find out what they're capable of when the weight is finally lifted.